One candidate who won't be on that debate stage, former Congressman John Delaney. He's one of 7 Democratic candidates who didn't qualify. I had the chance to speak with him before he gave a foreign policy speech at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. The entrepreneur and former representative from Maryland has been running for president the longest out of anyone in the field, more than 2 years. He's still polling below 1% nationally and around 1% in the first-in-the-nation caucus state of Iowa, where he just wrapped up his 36th visit. I started our conversation by asking him why he's staying in the race.
You know, I think the polling, 3 or 4 candidates are getting a lot of attention, and the rest of us are polling in the low single digits. So I kind of think the race is still wide open. I think the 3 leading candidates are vulnerable in many ways in a race against President Trump. So I don't really think any of the polls really matter into the Iowa caucus, which is not that far away, but folks in Iowa are really now starting to pay attention. And I think they're going to disconnect from the national polling and really make the decisions the way they always have, which is by meeting people and getting a sense for who they are. I think I'm the right person for the job for very different reasons. I think the central issue facing this country is how terribly divided we are. And I think our next president has to be someone who wants to unify this terribly divided nation. And that's been a core tenet of my campaign from the beginning. I also think we need to actually start solving some of these problems. And a lot of people who are running on kind of impossible promises or things that'll never happen. And what our next president needs to do is actually start addressing some of these issues. So we need someone who's got a track record like I do, not only as a bipartisan leader in the Congress, but also as a successful entrepreneur, someone who started businesses, created thousands of jobs. No one else has that background who's running.
If you don't finish in the top tier in Iowa, are you prepared to leave the race, or do you plan to keep going?
Well, I've always said Iowa is very important to me, so I have to do well in Iowa.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. I want to briefly touch upon the impeachment inquiry. Sure. I know that you had said for months that you kind of deferred to Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi for the best path forward and holding the president accountable. Last week you said that she made the right decision in launching this official impeachment inquiry. Why defer to her?
Well, in part because I think she actually has really good judgment on this issue. So I think an impeachment is a process that originates in the House. So I think we have a person who's the Speaker of the House, who's incredibly talented, has terrific judgment, has a lot of experience, and she's the person in many ways defending the democracy. So I really I do believe that people like myself who are running for president really should defer to her on this issue. And that it's not helpful for us to be calling for premature impeachment inquiries before she's ready. I think she's handled this perfectly. I think she resisted a lot of premature calls. But when this current incident happened, I think she knew this was the kind of thing that he needed to be held accountable for.
Let's get to the reason why you're here in Chicago. Yes. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs. You're here to give a speech on American foreign policy. First off, what is the biggest challenge facing the U.S. when it comes to foreign policy, in your opinion?
Well, I just think reestablishing the relationship with our allies is really important. The world's become incredibly interconnected and interdependent. And that affects the U.S. citizens very much, positively and negatively. And what the world needs is U.S. leadership. And the way we've led historically is by working with our allies. And President Trump has really alienated our allies. He doesn't believe in that U.S. model, that kind of post-World War II model of U.S. engagement. And so in many ways, our biggest issue is reestablishing those alliances and getting back to the business of kind of leading the world. Because we have a lot of issues. Nuclear proliferation is still a huge issue. Climate change is an issue. A lot of states right now in the world don't control their own borders because of technology. And, both the enormously positive effect it's had, but the negative effect. So there are a lot of really important issues going on around the world. And I think the world is really desperate for U.S. leadership. And reasserting that leadership is a big part of my foreign policy campaign.
As you mentioned, you're a businessman. You've built 2 companies, publicly traded. You have said President Trump was correct in taking on China, but you don't agree with his approach. What would you do differently?
So I think he was correct in identifying that we have a big issue with China. And I think he spoke up about that issue more than other people did, and I think he was correct about that. I think his diagnosis of what the issue is is wrong. He thinks the issue is the trade deficit. And while that's not great, it's not really the biggest problem. The biggest problem is the fact that China steals pretty much everything, and in particular, intellectual property. That's the biggest issue. And the way to deal with that issue is not by getting involved in an old-fashioned tariff war, which is in fact about the trade deficit, right? Trying to change who's buying what. The way you deal with intellectual property theft is you have to, again, work through our allies. And you have to go to China as a unified front with all of our allies and the U.S. private sector, and basically present an ultimatum to China around intellectual property theft. That would be my focus. You also have to compete with them, which is why I care about things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and stuff like that.
And I was going to say, I mean, you support rejoining TPP to take on China.
Surprisingly, I'm the only one. I mean, this was President Obama's signature kind of initiative in his second term in office, and he was right about it.
Moving to Iran, because there are a ton of foreign policy hotspots
It's a big world out
on the president's plate. We've heard some lawmakers say it's time for military strikes after this latest, attacks on the Saudi oil facilities. Of course, the U.S. and several other countries blame Iran for that. Do you support military strikes?
I don't support military strikes to defend Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure. No, I do not.
Okay, and then in terms of your plan reducing tensions with Iran, how would you go about doing that? Would you rejoin the Iran nuclear deal?
I would. I'd want to make the terms better. I voted for the Iran nuclear deal. I think it had some real flaws, but I still think it was better than the alternative, and we're seeing the alternative now.
And what changes would you specifically make to the terms?
The biggest change I would make is to extend the term, because the big flaw with the original deal was that the term was too short. Right, it was like a 10-year deal. And I would like an agreement that we at least have a chance for there to be a different regime in control of Iran by the time the deal expires. So that's why a 20 or 25-year deal, I think, would have been a much better outcome.
And just briefly, North Korea, I mean, they just launched more projectiles. At this point, if you became president and you were in President Trump's shoes right now, would you still be trying to negotiate denuclearization with North Korea? How would you go about doing it, and would it be different than what President Trump did?
You know, it's probably the one area where I've been the least critical of the administration. I don't think it was a bad idea to start engagement with North Korea. I really don't. Because you have to engage in diplomacy with people you don't like if you want any kind of an outcome ultimately that's better. So I do think engagement is the right thing. I think our goal ultimately has to be denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. It's going to take a long time to get there. We're going to have a lot of very, very, very small steps along the way. But what I wouldn't do, for example, and what I worry the current administration might do, is agree to withdraw a significant amount of U.S. troops from the Asia-Pacific region in exchange for small concessions. I think North Korea should be making concessions about their nuclear program just to begin to gain some renewed access in the global economy, that we shouldn't have to make concessions around our military presence.
In terms of easing up on sanctions on North Korea, would you support that?
You know, again, everything's tied to a verifiable action. So if North Korea takes tangible steps to reduce their nuclear capability with a path towards denuclearization, then obviously relief of certain economic sanctions, not all of them, are a way of having a path to that kind of a deal.